And I remember in the morning after the 2019 election being asked to go to London to take part in BBC Question Time. So I set off having had less than an hour's sleep. And when I was on the show, I was actually a bit stunned that one of the London audience asked the old question, can Scotland afford to be independent? And I remember thinking, really? That old chestnut? I thought that'd been dealt with back in 2014 when even David Cameron was forced to admit that Scotland had what it took to be independent. But it's clear even now that the myth of too poor is still doing the rounds. So let's deal with that. Coming to you, Alison, first. Let's just take that question. Can Scotland afford to be an independent country?
Of course, absolutely it could. We can't afford not to be independent in many ways. I'd consider, and I suppose one of the things that gets reflected, and you see this popping up on social media every now and again, is what was said about Malta, is what was said about the likes of Singapore, that they couldn't afford to be independent, and look at them now. Nobody is questioning that now, and no country that has gained its independence has ever gone back into a union once having done so. So I think that question is really one that ought to have been answered. I suppose it's how closely people are paying attention, and perhaps it's that UK Question Time audience, where perhaps the debates that we've been having in Scotland are not that wider debate that's happening across the rest of the UK. But unquestionably, Scotland can afford to be independent.
I'm no economist, but I'm told by economists that the basis for a really healthy economy is that country's assets. And Scotland's blessed with enormous natural assets, human capital. It has pretty much all the mechanisms of an advanced economy. Roger, what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of an asset base, proportionately, it's one of the richest countries in the world. Now, there's a difference, however, between having assets such as those you've already mentioned, Drew, like very well-educated population, natural resources and the like. There's a difference between having the assets and then having those assets husbanded and utilised effectively in the interests of society. And that's where the problem is with our assets. It's not the asset base, it's the way in which political decisions are made that affect them. I was talking a good month or so back with a good friend of mine, David Simpson, Professor David Simpson, and he said to me of his many years, he wrote the first, as far as I'm aware, serious paper on the economics of independence back in the 1960s. And he said, there's a fascinating thing. He said, if you look at many of the papers that are produced, whether by those who are unionists or those who are in favour of independence, there is often the phrase comes up about what's the cost of independence. He says, nobody has ever put together the information to answer the question, what is the price of dependence? And his view is that that's a piece of work that needs doing, and that's something that I have started a little project on to begin to look at, and that is the price of dependence. You know, when, for example, no doubt we'll get on to talk about things like debt and the deficit. Any debt and deficit that arises in Scotland at the moment is a function of what? It's not a function of our assets. It's not a function of what we could be. It's a function of the economic management by the UK historically.
Mm-hmm. And
that is our fundamental issue and why we need to pursue independence as quickly as possible.
And that historical impact of not being able to make decisions, Alison, here in terms of what's right for the people here has a big impact across society, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And when you look at things like the potential that we have of those assets, of what we hold, we've got 25% of the offshore wind resources in Europe, 25% of the tidal energy resources in Europe, but yet the way the UK energy grid is set up penalises us for having those assets.
Mm-hmm. You're making a terrific point, and in the meantime, Westminster's pointed towards wasteful new nuclear.
Absolutely. So you're going, these are decisions taken by the UK government, not in Scotland's interests, actively working against what we would like to develop and where we would like to be. And it just seems to me that until we get the full control over those resources, till we're able to husband them as Roger has said, we're not making the most of what those assets could be, and pointing the skills of our people towards those assets as well. And you say, well, if you're going to build this, if you're going to develop this out, in these different areas, you need the skilled people standing behind it to make the most of those resources too.